The first sound was a low guttural rumble, a vibration that worked its way up from the soles of Caroline Parker's sensible New Balance walking shoes and into her very bones. It was a sound wholly alien to the manicured serenity of the Whispering Aspen's Homeowners Association, a sound of raw, unapologetic power. She initially dismissed it as a distant thunderstorm, but the sky above was a flawless, mercilessly blue canvas. Her gaze snapped from the petition clipboard in her hand, toward the source, the sprawling, chaotic acreage of the stone ranch. There, cresting a small rise, like a monstrous green beast of mythology, was the tractor, a John Deere. The tires alone were taller than her meticulously placed, HOA-approved ornamental fence. At its helm sat Jedediah Stone, his face set like a granite cliff under the shadow of a dusty cowboy hat. "He wouldn't dare," whispered Gary, a retired actuary, and Caroline's most fervent disciple on the HOA board. He clutched his own picket sign, "Farm filth has no place here," written in a surprisingly elegant cursive, like a holy relic. Caroline's lips thinned into a razor-straight line. "Hold your ground, Gary, we have a permit." It wasn't, strictly speaking, a permit. It was a printout from the county clerk's website about public assembly rights, highlighted in 3 different colors. But to Caroline, whose entire existence was a carefully curated collection of rules, bylaws, and covenants, it was tantamount to a holy decree. The tractor didn't slow. It moved with a terrifying, deliberate speed. Its engine's roar swallowing the chirping of the birds and the nervous murmurs of the half-dozen other Whispering Aspen's residents she had rallied to her cause. They were camped if one could call it that on a patch of dusty land just beyond her own property line. She had researched it for weeks, cross-referencing satellite imagery with a plat map she'd downloaded from the county assessor's Zillow page. It was, she had triumphantly declared at the last emergency HOA meeting, an unassigned public easement, a no-man's land, her land, for all intents and purposes. For the duration of this protest, her protest camp was a masterpiece of suburban order. A crisp, white 10x10 pop-up tent served as command headquarters. Beneath it, a folding table held neatly stacked petitions, a carafe of chilled lemon water, and a Tupperware container of her famous low-carb lemon scones. The picket signs were all uniformly sized. The slogans focus group tested via the neighborhood Facebook group. This wasn't a protest. It was an extension of her will, a landscaped installation of righteous indignation. The target of this indignation was the smell. 2 weeks ago, Jedediah Stone had introduced a drove of pigs to his property, not more than a quarter-mile from Caroline's back patio. The stench, a thick, pervasive miasma of mud and manure, had descended upon Whispering Aspens like a biblical plague, clung to the taupe-colored siding, seeped through weather-sealed windows, and, most offensively, ruined the subtle notes of lavender and chamomile from her plug-in air fresheners. It was an olfactory assault on property values. The tractor was now 50 yards away. The ground was visibly trembling. Caroline squeaked a woman named Sandra, her face pale beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat. "Maybe we should move back, just to the curb." "We will do no such thing," Caroline commanded, her voice ringing with the authority she'd honed over a decade of ruling the HOA Architectural Review Committee. "We are citizens exercising our rights. The law is on our side." He is bluffing. She truly believed it. In Caroline's world, there were rules for everything. There were rules for the precise shade of beige your garage door could be painted. Dune Edwards Fine Grain, DE 6213. There were rules for the maximum height of a basketball hoop 10 feet, but only during active play. There were rules for the minimum number of blooming perennials required in a front yard flower bed 6. With seasonal variety, a man couldn't just introduce a pigsty that stank up a multi-million-dollar development without there being a rule against it. When she discovered to her horror that no such specific rule existed, the ranch predated the development by had simply decided to create the rule herself through sheer force of will. The tractor was 20 yards out. The roar was deafening. Jedediah Stone's eyes, even from this distance, were like chips of ice. He wasn't looking at the protesters. He was looking through them, at a point somewhere beyond. Caroline took a half step forward, planting her feet. A suburban Boudica, facing down the legions of chaos. She held up a hand, palm out, a universal sign to stop. It was the same gesture she used to halt contractors, whose trucks were leaking oil onto the pristine asphalt of Whispering Aspen's lane. It had never failed her. The John Deere did not stop. The moment of impact was a cacophony of disbelief. The massive front tire caught the leg of the folding table first. The carafe of lemon water exploded in a shower of glass and citrus-infused spray. The Tupperware of scones was launched into the air, spinning like a clay pigeon before shattering against the tractor's grill. Then it hit the tent. With a sound like a giant tearing a bedsheet, the metal frame twisted, buckled, and was swallowed under the chassis. Caroline's meticulously organized command center was gone in an instant. Shrieked and scrambled backward, tripping over a camping chair and landing in a heap of undignified limbs. The others scattered like startled pigeons, their professionally printed signs abandoned on the ground, but not Caroline. She was frozen, not by fear, but by a rage so pure and white-hot, it burned away every other emotion. He was driving through her things, her tent, her petitions, her authority. The tractor's wheel, caked in mud and things she refused to contemplate, rolled directly over a sign that read, "Our noses have rights." The wooden stake snapped with a sharp crack that was somehow audible, even over the engine. He wasn't just clearing his land, he was making a statement. He was mocking her. Jedediah Stone drove a straight, unwavering line through the heart of her campsite, never once turning his head. The tractor continued for another 100 yards into his own property before the engine noise finally died down, leaving a sudden ringing silence broken only by Sandra's quiet sobbing. The devastation was absolute. Her camp looked like the miniature tornado. Splintered wood, torn canvas, and the pathetic, scattered remains of her scones littered the dusty ground. The air, now thick with the scent of diesel fumes, mingled with the ever-present odor of pig manure to create a truly vomiting-inducing perfume. For a long moment, Carolyn just stood there, her entire body trembling. This was not how the world worked. Order did not simply yield to brute force. Rules were not suggestions to be bulldozed by agricultural machinery. A deep, primal humiliation washed over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since a middle school spelling bee in 1978. Then, the humiliation curdled, hardening into something cold, dense, and incredibly heavy. It was resolve. "Gary said, her voice dangerously calm. "Call 911. Tell them there has been an assault, with a deadly weapon." "Ma'am, let me see if I have this straight," said Deputy Miller. He was young, with a face that looked like it had never needed to shave and a calm demeanor that Caroline found profoundly grating. He leaned against the hood of his patrol car, notepad in hand, making no effort to observe the wreckage with the appropriate level of horror. They were standing on the edge of the road, the scene of the crime laid out before them. The other protesters had retreated to the sidewalk, whispering amongst themselves and casting nervous glances at Caroline. "It's very simple, Deputy," Caroline said, enunciating each word as if speaking to a particularly dense toddler. "That man," she pointed a trembling finger toward the stone ranch house, a rustic, sprawling structure that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself, "used that war machine to intentionally destroy our private property and endanger our lives. We were peacefully assembled. He drove right at us." "Uh-huh," Miller said, scribbling a note. "And where exactly were you assembled?" "On the public easement," Caroline stated with unwavering certainty. "I have the documentation right here." She thrust the Zillow Plat map at him, the page now smudged with dirt and a faint oily residue from a scone. The deputy gave the printout a cursory glance, his lips twitching slightly. "Ma'am, this is a screenshot from a real estate website. It's not a legal survey. It's from the county assessor's database. It clearly shows a 20-foot buffer between my property line and his fence." From across the way, the screen door of the ranch house creaked open. Jedediah Stone ambled toward them. He moved with an unhurried, bow-legged gait that spoke of a lifetime on his feet. He stopped a respectful distance away, hooking his thumbs in his worn leather belt. He hadn't said a word to her yet, and his silence was more infuriating than any insult. "Mr. Stone," the deputy said, his tone shifting to one of casual familiarity. "This lady and her friends are saying you ran over their campsite." "Yep," Jedediah said. His voice was a low baritone, like rocks tumbling in a riverbed. "They're saying they were on a public easement," the deputy continued, his eyes fixed on the rancher. Jedediah Stone's gaze shifted to Carolyn. For the first time, he looked directly at her. His eyes were a startlingly pale blue, weathered at the corners but missing nothing. "There's no easement there. Frank never has be." The morning after her discovery was crystalline and sharp. While the rest of Whispering Aspens slept, Carolyn Parker was already at war. The battlefield was her gleaming oak desk, her weapons, the precise, unforgiving clauses of bureaucratic regulation. The humiliation of the tractor incident had been a blunt force trauma. This was the work of a surgeon. She spent 3 hours composing the complaint. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression and weaponized legalese. She didn't write it as a scorned neighbor, but as a concerned citizen and president of the Whispering Aspens Homeowners Association. She didn't mention the smell of pigs once. Instead, she wrote of potential unregulated hydrogeological impact, unpermitted expansion of commercial agricultural activity, and the critical need to uphold the integrity of the 1957 Gila County Water Accord for the preservation of our shared aquifer. She attached a higher resolution scan of the Environmental Review Addendum, highlighting the key sentence in a tasteful, yet firm, digital yellow dot. She addressed it not to the local deputy who had so casually dismissed her, but to the Gila County Department of Environmental Quality and, for good measure, the Arizona State Water Resources Board. She knew from her time on the board that local authorities were often mired in familiarity and common sense. State-level bureaucrats, however, were creatures of pure process. They lived and breathed the labyrinthine codes she was now navigating. They were her people. She clicked send on the emails, and the silence of her home office felt like the moment after a cannon has been fired, a pregnant pause awaiting the distant impact. A week later, the first tremor of her victory arrived. She called an emergency session of the HOA board, held not in the community clubhouse, which felt too public, but in the formal dining room of her own home. The table was polished to a mere shine, and she served iced tea in tall sweating glasses with sprigs of mint from her herb garden. It was an exercise in civilized control. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. She began, her voice calm and measured. Gary, the retired actuary, leaned forward, his expression one of rapt attention. Brenda, a kindly woman who ran a daycare from her home, offered a hesitant smile. The other two board members, a husband and wife team, who always voted as a block, looked vaguely confused. As you know, Caroline continued, our community has recently been subjected to a significant environmental and olfactory imposition from the adjacent property. Gary nodded vigorously. The pigs stink. It's a menace. Caroline held up a hand, gracefully cutting him off. While the immediate effects are unpleasant, a direct confrontation has proven to be, shall we say, counterproductive. A flicker of the tractor's shadow passed behind her eyes. Therefore, I have been pursuing a more strategic, legally sound avenue to protect our collective property values and quality of life. She laid out her discovery of the 1957 water accord with the flair of a prosecuting attorney revealing the murder weapon. She explained the nuance of the commercial expansion clause and the leverage it afforded them. She presented it not as an act of revenge, but as a brilliant tactical maneuver, a matter of fiduciary responsibility to the homeowners they represented. By filing a formal inquiry with the State Water Board, she concluded, we force Mr. Stone to legally justify his new operation. They will be required to conduct a site inspection and an audit of his water usage. The process alone is incredibly arduous and expensive. Best case scenario, they shut down his unpermitted operation. Worst case, he will be so mired in red tape that the pigs will be the least of his worries. A stunned silence fell over the dining table. Brenda was the first to break it, her brow furrowed with concern. Caroline, I don't know. This feels very aggressive. We're talking about a man's well, his water. Isn't this a little outside the scope of the HOA? We're supposed to be dealing with lawn maintenance and holiday decorations. Caroline fixed Brenda with a patient, pitying smile. Brenda, with all due respect, you're thinking too small. What is the single most important mandate of this board? It's to protect and enhance the property values of Whispering Espins. A neighboring unregulated pig farm is a direct threat to that mandate. This isn't personal, she lied smoothly. This is business. We are simply using the legal tools at our disposal to mitigate a financial threat. She's right, Gary chimed in, puffing out his chest. It's a brilliant move. No fuss, no muss. We let the state do the dirty work. It's clean. The irony of him using the word clean was not lost on Caroline. She pressed her advantage. All I am asking for today is the board's official support. I move that we pass a resolution formally endorsing the complaint filed with the State Water Board, and that we allocate a preliminary budget of $2,000 for legal consultation, should Mr. Stone decide to challenge us. Brenda looked aghast. $2,000 of homeowner dues? To go after a farmer's well? To protect a multi-million-dollar investment? Caroline corrected gently. It's a pittance to ensure our community doesn't end up smelling like a barnyard forever. All in favor? Caroline raised her hand. Gary's shot up immediately. After a moment of whispered debate, the husband and wife block raised their hands in unison. It was 4-1. Brenda sank back in her chair, a look of profound unease on her face. Caroline felt a surge of triumph. She had consolidated her power. The HOA was now officially complicit. It was no longer her personal vendetta. It was a righteous crusade sanctioned by a governing body. The call came 2 days later, from a number with a Phoenix area code. Am I speaking with a Ms. Carolyn Parker? The voice was reedy and officious, the voice of a man who enjoyed flowcharts. This is she, Carolyn said, her posture straightening at her desk. Double quotes, Ms. Parker. My name is Arthur Evans. I'm a junior compliance officer with the Arizona State Water Resources Board. I'm calling in reference to your formal complaint regarding Parcel 7B, owned by a Mr. Jedediah Stone. File number, SWRB 202-5784. Caroline's heart gave a little flutter. A file number? It was real. Yes, Mr. Evans. I'm glad you received it. I trust the documentation was sufficient. Ma'am, it was exemplary. The citation of the 57 Accord, the cross-reference to the 98 Environmental Review. It's rare we get a civilian complaint with this level of detail. You've saved our department weeks of preliminary research. Vindication washed over her, sweet and intoxicating. She was a natural, a prodigy of bureaucratic warfare. I simply believe in being thorough, she said with false modesty. Indeed, Mr. Evans chirped. Well, I'm calling to inform you that based on the strength of your filing, we have officially opened an inquiry. A notice of inquiry has been sent via certified mail to Mr. Stone, and we have scheduled a preliminary site inspection for next Tuesday. We're taking your concerns regarding a potential unpermitted diversion of protected groundwater very seriously. I see, Caroline said, the picture of composure, though inside she was fizzing with delight. And what does a site inspection entail? Oh, one of our field hydrologists will go out, inspect the wellhead, check the pump's flow meter. It even has one end, take water samples. We'll ask Mr. Stone to provide all documentation and permits related to his water usage and any commercial activities tied to it. It's all very standard procedure. Standard procedure for them. For Jedediah Stone, she imagined, it would be anything but. Thank you for the update, Mr. Evans. You've been very helpful. Thank you for your civic diligence, Ms. Parker. She hung up the phone and allowed herself a moment to gaze out her picture window. The manicured lawns and identical beige houses of Whispering Aspens stretched out before her, a testament to order. And beyond them, the chaotic green of the Stone Ranch. A shadow was about to fall on that chaos. A shadow made of paper. Later that week, Caroline was taking her prescribed afternoon constitutional, a brisk walk around the perimeter of Whispering Aspens. The route was precisely 2.8 miles, and she timed it daily. It was on the final leg, passing along the street that bordered the ranch, that she saw it. Jedediah Stone's battered Ford pickup was parked on the street, not in front of his property, but in front of Bill Henderson's house. Bill Henderson was a mild-mannered accountant who had, for the past 6 months, been in violation of Covenant 14C, the clause prohibiting whimsical or figurative statuary, on account of a cheerful round-bellied garden gnome who sat fishing in his bird. Caroline had sent him 2 warning letters already. She slowed her pace, her curiosity piqued. As she drew nearer, she saw Bill and Jedediah at the back of the truck, laughing. Jed was using a pitchfork to heave bales of hay from his truck into Bill's open garage. It was a simple, neighborly scene, a transaction. And to Caroline, it was a profound betrayal. She felt an irrational spike of fury. Here she was, fighting a lonely war to protect the very fabric of their community, and one of her own subjects was openly consorting with the enemy. He was giving him money, fueling his operation, undermining her authority. She waited until Jed's truck had rumbled away before she altered her course, marching directly up Bill Henderson's paver-stone driveway. He was still in the garage, stacking the hay. Bill, she said. Her voice was flat and cold. He turned, startled, wiping sweat from his brow. Oh, hello, Caroline. Hot one today. I was surprised to see you conducting business with. The week after the for sale sign appeared was a new kind of torture for Caroline Parker. It was the quiet agony of waiting for an enemy's move. Each passing car on County Road 12 might be a potential buyer for Jet's land. Each morning, she expected a new development, and each day that passed, with only the drone of the cicadas, felt like a tightening of a spring. The war had gone silent, and the silence was unnerving. The counteroffensive arrived not with the roar of a tractor, but with the quiet thud of a FedEx envelope on her porch mat. It was thick, heavy with purpose, and addressed to Caroline Parker. In her official capacity as president of the Whispering Aspens Homeowners Association, the return address was stark and professional. Hackett, Roth, and Morales, attorneys at law. Her hands trembled slightly as she sliced it open with a silver letter opener. Inside, the paper was a heavy, creamy stock, the letterhead embossed. This wasn't the flimsy output of a home printer. This was the armor of a serious legal firm. The letter itself was a dense 3-page document of chillingly polite prose. It began by confirming that their firm was now representing Mr. Jedediah Stone in the matter of the complaint filed with the State Water Board. Then came the attack. It was a section titled, Formal Notice of Anticipated Litigation and Demand for Preservation of Evidence. The legal jargon was thick, but the meaning was brutally clear. They were demanding that the HOA preserve every single piece of communication related to Jedediah Stone. All emails, text messages, voicemails, handwritten notes, memoranda, and minutes from both formal and informal meetings. It went further, demanding all posts, comments, and direct messages from the private neighborhood Facebook group. They weren't just coming for her official records. They were coming for the whispers, the gossip, the digital chatter of her entire community. The letter ended by stating that a formal discovery request would follow, and that any attempt to delete, alter, or conceal evidence would be met with a motion for sanctions for spoliation of evidence. Caroline read the sentence twice. Spoliation of evidence. It was a legal term, but it felt like a moral accusation, as if they were already calling her a criminal. Her meticulously organized world, her carefully controlled narratives, they were about to be ripped open and pawed through by strangers. Her private war was about to become public record. She immediately called another emergency board meeting in her dining room. The atmosphere this time was not one of strategic excitement, but of barely concealed panic. The iced tea went untouched. This is an outrage. Gary sputtered after reading the letter, his face flushed. It's a scare tactic. They can't just demand our private emails. Actually, Gary, they can, Brenda said, her voice quiet but firm. The fear was gone from her face, replaced by a grim resignation. She looked at Caroline, a flicker of accusation in her eyes. This is what happens when you poke a bear with a stick. Caroline, I warned you. A discovery request in a civil suit is They're looking for evidence of a coordinated campaign of harassment. They're trying to prove this was never about water. They're trying to prove malice. The word hung in the air, Malice. The husband and wife block. The Millers looked horrified. Wait, a lawsuit? Mrs. Miller asked, her voice cracking. I thought we were just filing a complaint. Nobody said anything about being sued. My texts to my sister about that awful smell. Are they going to read those? If they're deemed relevant? Potentially, yes, Brenda said gravely. We didn't sign up for this, Mr. Miller exclaimed, throwing his hands up. This has gone too far. I want to rescind my vote. I want us to withdraw the complaint. We can't, Caroline said, her voice tight. She was losing control of the room. Withdrawing it now would be an admission of guilt. It would only strengthen his case against us. We have to hold the line. Hold the line. Caroline, they're threatening to subpoena us, Mrs. Miller wailed. I'm not losing my house because you have a personal problem with our neighbor. The unity of the board, her power base, shattered in that moment. The $2,000 they had allocated for a legal consultation now seemed like a child's allowance in the face of a looming catastrophe. She had led her flock into a slaughterhouse. The day of the state-mandated site inspection, Caroline positioned herself in her second-floor sitting room, a pair of birdwatching binoculars in her hand. It offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the section of Yates Ranch where the old well was located. She felt like a general observing enemy movements from a fortified hill. A state-issued sedan crunched up Yates' gravel driveway first. A man in a collared shirt with a government logo got out, clipboard in hand. This must be the field hydrologist. A few minutes later, Jedediah emerged from his house. But he wasn't alone. With him was a woman. She was tall and slim, with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She wore dark trousers, sensible-looking leather boots that were already dusty, and a crisp white shirt under a black blazer. She moved with an air of sharp, efficient confidence. As they walked toward the wellhead, she wasn't trailing behind Jed. She was walking alongside him, listening intently, her head nodding as he spoke and pointed. This had to be one of the lawyers. Maria Morales, perhaps. Caroline focused the binoculars. She could see the lawyer's face now. It was sharp-featured and intelligent. She watched as Morales greeted the state official not with deference, but as an equal. She shook his hand firmly. She gestured toward the well, speaking with an authority that seemed to put the official on his back foot. She wasn't just observing. She was managing the inspection, controlling the narrative on the ground. Jed stood beside her, his arms crossed, no longer looking weary but watchful. He looked protected. Caroline lowered the binoculars, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She had grievously underestimated her opponent. She had pictured Jed as a simple farmer, overwhelmed by the bureaucratic machine she had set in motion. She had been fighting a man, but now, watching Maria Morales operate, she realized she was fighting an organization, a team of professionals who navigated this world as skillfully as she navigated HOA bylaws. Jedediah Stone now had a champion, and from 200 yards away, Caroline could see that she was formidable. The true brilliance of Hackett, Roth and Morales' strategy became apparent 2 days later. A revised version of the legal letter arrived in the mailbox of every single one of the 84 homes in Whispering Aspens. It was retitled as a notice to potential witnesses in pending litigation regarding HOA actions. The language was softer, less threatening than the letter she had received, but its effect was devastating. It calmly explained that a dispute initiated by the HOA board might require testimony from residents. It mentioned the possibility of depositions and subpoenas as a standard part of the legal process to ascertain the facts. It ended by providing a contact number at the law firm for anyone who had relevant information they wished to share regarding the HOA's motivations. It was a masterstroke. It was an open invitation for dissent. The neighborhood Facebook group, the Digital Kingdom, where her decrees were once law, erupted into chaos. The carefully curated feed of posts about lost cats and recommendations for gardeners was replaced by a firestorm of panic and rage. Can someone please explain why I'm getting letters from a lawyer? What did the board do? Deposition. I'm not getting dragged into court over a pig farm. This is insane. My husband just called. The Millers are saying Caroline Parker started a lawsuit without a full community vote. Is this true? We are going to be on the hook for the legal fees. Gary tried to run damage control, posting a blustering defense of the board's actions, but he was shouted down. Brenda posted a single, cryptic comment. Some of us voiced strong objections. The community turned on Caroline with the ferocity of a predator sensing a wounded leader. She was no longer their protector. She was the person who had brought this plague of lawyers upon their houses. Her name was invoked not with respect, but with fury. The digital mob was at her gates. Faced with a full-scale insurrection, Caroline did the only thing she could. She used the HOAS funds to schedule an urgent consultation with their own lawyer, a man named Davies, whose firm was kept on a modest retainer to handle covenant violations. Mr. Davies' office was a bland suite of rooms in a suburban office park. He was a portly man with a tired-looking mustache who listened patiently as Caroline laid out the situation. Framing herself as the victim of an aggressive legal ambush, she handed him the letter from Hackett, Roth, and Morales. He read it, his brow furrowing. He read it again, letting out a low whistle. Wow, he said, looking up at her over his reading glasses. They're not messing around. It's an intimidation tactic, Caroline insisted. No, it's not, Davies corrected her bluntly. It's a textbook, hardball, discovery, demand, and it's ironclad. You have to comply, Caroline. Everything. The emails between you and Gary. The meeting minutes where Brenda objected. All of it. He leaned back in his chair. Frankly, I know Maria Morales by reputation. She's sharp. She doesn't bluff. Caroline felt a chill. What are our options? Davies steepled his fingers. You can fight it. A legal battle over this could run, I don't know, $50,000–$100,000? Pretty easily. Maybe more if it goes to trial. He paused. And I've just reviewed the HOA's liability policy. The director and officer clause has an Victory, Caroline discovered, was a bitter and public pill to swallow. She stood before the reconvened HOA board in her dining room, a portrait of manufactured humility. The air was thick with resentment. Brenda wouldn't meet her eye, looked at her as if she were a venomous insect, and even Gary's adoring gaze had been replaced by a wounded confusion. After careful consideration, Caroline began, her voice modulated to a tone of profound sincerity, and upon the strong recommendation of our legal counsel, Mr. Davies, I believe it is in the best interest of the Whispering Aspens community to withdraw our complaint with the State Water Resources Board. A collective sigh of relief, heavy and ragged, filled the room. I believe, she continued, pressing a hand to her chest in a gesture of contrived repentance, that my approach, while well-intentioned, was perhaps too aggressive. My sole desire was to protect our quality of life, but I see now that it has caused undue stress and anxiety for the board and for our neighbors. For that, I am truly sorry. It was a masterful performance. She was offering them not just a retreat, but an absolution of their own culpability. It was her fault, her misjudgment. By falling on a sword of her own design, she was giving them an easy way out. Brenda's shoulders sagged with relief. Mr. Miller actually muttered, "Thank you, Caroline." She personally drafted the letter of withdrawal and the official apology to Jedediah Stone that afternoon. The apology was a work of art, a hollow masterpiece of corporate speak that expressed regret for the misunderstanding, and wished him all the best in his agricultural endeavors. It conceded nothing, admitted no wrongdoing, but gave the appearance of total surrender. She hand-delivered copies to the board members and emailed a PDF to Mr. Davies to be forwarded to Hackett, Roth, and Morales. The legal war was officially over. A ceasefire had been called, and under the cover of that ceasefire, Caroline began to plan her real war. Her reconnaissance mission began at dusk 2 days later. Dressed in dark yoga pants and a black fleece jacket, she ventured into the one part of Whispering Aspens she truly despised, the undeveloped common area at the far end of the property. It was a strip of land behind the backyards of the most expensive homes, a liminal space of untamed desert scrub, weeds, and the ghosts of construction debris. It offended her sense of order. She moved through the scratchy bushes, the pristine white soles of her walking shoes turning a dusty gray. Her destination was the spot Brenda had mentioned in that long-forgotten email. After 10 minutes of searching, she found it. The covert opening was larger than she had imagined, a gaping concrete mouth nearly 4 feet in diameter, mostly hidden by overgrown creosote bushes. A heavy rust-streaked iron grate, bolted into the concrete, covered the entrance. The air emanating from it was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and decay. It was the subterranean artery connecting her world to his, a secret passageway hidden from view. Peering through the grate, she could see nothing but profound darkness. This was the place. This was the weapon. Her preparations were meticulous and covert. Over the next 3 nights, she became a scavenger, a shadow flitting through the manicured perfection of her own neighborhood. She wore her husband's old gardening gloves. She collected rocks and broken pieces of cinder block from the common area, piling them behind a thicket of palo verde. From her neighbor's green recycling bins, set out on the curb for trash day, she stole bags of dense, wet lawn clippings, dragging them into the shadows. She was getting her hands dirty, an act so contrary to her nature that it felt both transgressive and exhilarating. She was no longer imposing order with rules and regulations. She was creating chaos with filth and debris. The perfect opportunity arrived the following week. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray as a summer monsoon, long predicted by the weather app she now obsessively monitored, rolled in from the south. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, Caroline slipped out her back door and into the gloom. The storm provided perfect cover. The wind lashed the trees, and the growing roar of the rain masked any sound she might make. Working quickly, guided by a small, powerful flashlight, she unbolted the heavy iron grate with a wrench from her husband's toolbox. The bolts were stiff with rust, and it took all her strength to turn them. Once the grate was pulled aside, she went to work. She didn't just pile the debris at the entrance. She shoved the rocks, the broken concrete, and the heavy sodden bags of grass deep into the culvert's maw. She used a long piece of discarded rebar she had found to ram the blockage tight, compacting it into a dense, almost impermeable plug 10 feet inside the pipe. It was an act of pure, calculated malice, performed in the wind and the rain. Finally, she dragged the grate back into place and tightened the bolts. Soaked, muddy, and breathing heavily, she retreated to her house, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and savage satisfaction. The trap was set. She didn't have to wait long. The monsoon was relentless, a torrential downpour that lasted for hours. By midnight, the first reports appeared on the neighborhood Facebook group. It was a post from a resident whose property backed onto the common area. Is anyone else's backyard flooding? I've got a lake back here. It included a photo of a patio set with its chair legs submerged in 2 inches of muddy water. Soon, others followed. More photos appeared. Submerged flower beds, water creeping up to back doors, a child's playground set looking like it was stranded on an island. The common area, unable to drain, had become a basin. The basin was overflowing. Carolyn stood at her upstairs window, watching the chaos unfold on her phone and in the world outside. The streetlights of Whispering Aspens reflected off vast sheets of standing water where pristine lawns should have been. Her plan had worked with terrifying efficiency. A grim sense of power coursed through her. She had bent the forces of nature to her will, but the satisfaction was tinged with a growing anxiety. The water levels were higher than she had anticipated. She saw flashing lights at the entrance to the development. The fire department. This was no longer a contained nuisance. It was a public emergency, driven by an overpowering need to see the full scope of her handiwork. She put on a raincoat and went out the back door. She didn't go toward the flooded homes but stayed on the high ground, making her way to the edge of the property, where the land sloped down toward Stone Ranch. She wanted to see his lower pasture inundated, his land ruined by the water that should have flowed through it. What she saw was far worse. The immense pressure of the backed-up water had been too much for the old land. It hadn't just seeped, it had burst. In a place some 50 yards from the culvert, the water had carved a whole new channel, exploding out of the saturated earth. It had created a violent, muddy torrent that had ripped a 10-foot-wide trench through Jedediah's main access road, the artery that connected his barns to his lower fields. The road was gone, replaced by a churning, impassable river of mud. She had not merely flooded him, she had crippled his ranch's infrastructure. As she stood there, mesmerized by the sheer destructive force she had unleashed, a truck with official county markings pulled up on the far side of the new trench. A man in a bright yellow rain slicker got out. He was soon joined by Jedediah and then, to Caroline's horror, by another figure emerging from the ranch house. It was Maria Morales, dressed in jeans, waterproof boots, and a rain jacket. She stood beside Jed, her face a grim mask as she surveyed the damage. They weren't looking at the swamped backyards of Whispering Aspens. They were looking at the washout. They were looking at the land, and their gaze followed the path of destruction upstream, toward the common area, toward the source of the blockage. Caroline's blood ran cold. This was no longer a private matter, of a blocked pipe. She hadn't just committed an act of vandalism against Jedediah, she had caused a catastrophic failure of a public storm drainage system. She had damaged private property, yes, but she had also triggered a county-level emergency. A new, one far more powerful player had just entered the game, the Gila County Flood Control District. She retreated to her house, her triumphant adrenaline replaced by ice-cold fear. This had spiraled beyond a feud. It was now an official investigation. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world of muck and devastation. The standing water in Whispering Aspens had begun to recede, but the lawns were ruined, coated in a slimy layer of mud. County vehicles were parked on the street. Caroline watched from her window as a man in a polo shirt with the Flood Control District logo walked the sodden common area. He carried a large map and was taking photos with his phone. And then her heart stopped. Out walking beside him, pointing, gesturing, her face a mask of cold fury, was Brenda. Brenda, whose daycare playground in her backyard was currently a swamp of mud and contaminated water. Brenda, the voice of reason she had so casually dismissed. Brenda, who had been on the pool committee. Caroline watched in horror as Brenda pointed directly, unequivocally, toward the thicket of creosote bushes, the spot where the culvert was hidden. Brenda remembered. In the face of the destruction of her own property, her own livelihood, she had put the pieces together. The sudden, inexplicable flooding, the location, the old email chain about the drainage culvert. The quiet objector was no longer quiet. The man from the Gila County Flood Control District was named Gus. He was a thick-set, patient man with sun-leathered skin and hands that looked strong enough to bend rebar, which, as it turned out, was a skill he occasionally needed. He listened to Brenda's story with a placid, unreadable expression, his gaze sweeping from her ruined daycare playground to the suspicious cluster of creosote bushes she was pointing at. Caroline watched from her upstairs window, the binoculars now feeling less like a tool of a general and more like the last vantage point of a cornered animal. She watched as Gus and 2 other county workers, armed with long-handled pry bars, converged on the spot Brenda had indicated. The world seemed to move in slow motion, every detail agonizingly sharp. It took them less than a minute to find the grate. With a groan of protesting metal, they pried it open. Gus knelt, aiming a powerful industrial flashlight into the culvert's maw. For a long moment, he was still. He then turned his head and looked directly at Brenda, and even from 200 yards away, Caroline could see his expression had changed. The placid patience was gone, replaced by a grim certainty. "Ma'am," Gus called out, his voice carrying on the still, humid air, "I think you just found our problem." The next hour was a methodical, brutal dissection of Caroline's sabotage. The workers used hooks and chains attached to a county truck to drag the contents of the culvert out into the daylight. The scene was laid bare on the muddy ground for all to see: the broken cinder blocks, the rocks from the common area, and, most damningly, the dark, decomposing clumps of what was clearly bagged lawn clippings. Caroline felt a wave of nausea. It looked exactly what it was: a deliberate, man-made blockage. It wasn't an act of God, it was an act of malice. Dumped unceremoniously on the now drying earth, Gus walked around the pile of debris, nudging a sodden, ripped plastic bag with his boot. The logo of a local landscaping company, the same one used by half the homes in Whispering Aspens, was faintly visible. He then squatted down and picked something up from the mud near the culvert entrance. He held it up to the light. It was small and metallic, a bolt, old, rusted, but with fresh wrench marks scarring its hexagonal head. Marks that would match a specific size of wrench. A wrench like the one in her husband Bob's neatly organized toolbox. The investigation pivoted with terrifying speed. Gus made a call on his radio. Within 20 minutes, another vehicle arrived. This one wasn't from flood control. It was a sheriff's department SUV, and Deputy Miller, he no longer looked young and bored. He looked annoyed. He conferred with Gus, who pointed at the pile of debris, the culvert, and the bolt in an evidence bag. And then, with an inevitability that felt like a physical blow, Deputy Miller, Brenda, and Gus all turned and looked up, their gazes sweeping across the back windows of the houses that overlooked the scene. Their eyes settled on Caroline's house. On her window, she jerked back, dropping the binoculars, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape her body. They knew. They didn't have proof yet, but they knew. The crime scene had a clear and obvious beneficiary, and a clear and obvious prime suspect. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled down the stairs, her mind a frantic whirl of incriminating evidence. The clothes she'd worn, the yoga pants and fleece, were sealed in a trash bag at the bottom of her laundry room hamper. The shoes were in a box in the garage, caked in dried mud, and the wrench. The wrench was back in Bob's toolbox, wiped clean. But was it clean enough? She felt the walls of her meticulously ordered home closing in. It was no longer a fortress. It was a container of evidence. Every surface she had touched, every item she had used, was now a potential betrayal. Her doorbell rang. The sound was as loud and violent as a gunshot in the silent house. She froze, standing in the middle of her foyer, her breath held tight in her chest. It was them. It had to be them. The bell rang again, longer this time, more insistent. With trembling hands, she smoothed her hair and walked to the door, composing her face into a mask of polite, neighborly concern. She opened it not to Deputy Miller, but to a grim-faced Mr. Davies, her lawyer. He was holding a briefcase and looked deeply unhappy. "Caroline," he said, skipping any pleasantry, "we need to talk now." He stepped inside, and she led him to the formal living room, a space reserved for guests and unpleasant conversations. "I just received a call from Maria Morales," Davies began, his voice flat. "She informed me that in light of the events of last night, Gila County is opening a criminal investigation into the destruction of public property and reckless endangerment. They have physical evidence of deliberate sabotage." "That's absurd," Caroline managed, her voice thin. Davies ignored her. "Morales is sharp, Caroline. She's not just representing Jed Stone in his civil claim anymore. She's positioning him as the primary victim in a criminal case against you. She told me, and I quote, 'Your client has escalated this from a dispute into a felony. My client's cooperation with the district attorney's office will be absolute.'" He let that sink in. The HOA, their homeowners policy, his own modest firm, they were all designed to handle civil disagreements over covenant violations. They were utterly unprepared for this. The board held an emergency phone vote less than an hour ago. Davies continued, his eyes cold. The Millers, Brenda, and even Gary. It was unanimous. In light of the potential for criminal charges, the HOA's insurance policy is null and void regarding this matter. They have voted to sever ties, which means, Caroline, my firm can no longer represent the HOA in this matter, and we certainly cannot represent you personally. You are on your own. He stood up, his briefcase clicking shut. "My official advice to you is this. Do not speak to anyone. Do not answer any questions. Say nothing. Hire a criminal defense attorney. You're going to need a very good one." He walked to the door and let himself out, leaving Caroline standing alone in the sterile silence of her formal living room. The last pillar of her support structure had crumbled. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of mounting dread. She watched from behind her blinds as sheriff's deputies went door to door, talking to her neighbors. They were interviewing everyone whose property backed onto the common area. They were asking questions. Had they seen anything, heard anything? Did they own a similar wrench set? Did they employ landscapers who used those specific bags? It was Annette, and it was tightening around her. She spent the afternoon cleaning. It was a frantic, desperate act of erasure. She took the muddy shoes and the clothes from the laundry room, sealed them in 3 layers of black trash bags, and buried them at the bottom of the large municipal bin in her garage, covering them with coffee grounds and kitchen scraps. She took her husband's entire wrench set and drove to a strip mall 5 miles away, dropping it into a Salvation Army donation bin. It was a flimsy, panicked attempt to cover her tracks, and she knew it. The most terrifying moment came when she saw Maria Morales' car pull up to the Stone Ranch house. A few minutes later, Jed and Morales walked out onto his ravaged property, meeting with Gus from flood control and a new man, a detective in a cheap suit. They stood at the edge of the washout that had been his access road. They weren't looking at the damage anymore. They were looking at something in the damage. The violent torrent of water had done more than just tear a trench through the road. It had acted like a power washer, scouring away decades of accumulated soil and gravel. And in the freshly carved wall of the new ravine, something had been exposed. From her window, Carolyn couldn't see what it was, only that it was dark and metallic, and that Jed was pointing at it with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not weariness, but shock. The detective knelt, pulling a pair of gloves from his pocket. Gus and Morales leaned in closer. They remained there for a long time, their focus entirely on this new, unexpected discovery. The investigation into the blocked culvert, into her crime, seemed to have been momentarily forgotten, overshadowed by something the flood had unearthed. New kind of fear, colder and sharper than before, pricked at Caroline. Her act of sabotage, intended to be a surgical strike against her enemy, had triggered a geological event. It had peeled back a layer of his land, exposing something hidden beneath. She had been so focused on bearing her own secrets that she had inadvertently dug up one of his. Late that night, long after the investigators had left, Caroline sat in her dark, silent house, her mind racing. The immediate threat of arrest felt paused. The focus of the investigation had shifted, but to what could possibly be buried under an old farm road? Her computer screen provided the only light. Her frantic earlier searches had been for rules and regulations. Now, her searches were different. Gila County cold cases, missing persons, Arizona 1980s, unidentified remains, ranch land. She didn't know what she was looking for, but the image of the detective pulling on his gloves was burned into her mind. She had wanted to create a problem for Jedediah Stone, to mire him in paperwork and legal trouble. But the raw elemental power of the water she had unleashed may have uncovered a problem far older and more dangerous than any zoning violation. The mystery of what lay buried in the trench had now eclipsed the certainty of her own guilt. The days that followed the discovery in the trench were the worst of Caroline Parker's life. Her house, once a sanctuary of order, became her prison. She kept the custom plantation shutters closed day and night, living in a state of twilight outside. Life in Whispering Aspens went on, but it was a life from which she was now excommunicated. Neighbors who once waved now turned their heads, pretending to check their mail. Children who cut across her lawn were hastily called back by their parents. She was a pariah, the mad queen of the HOA, deposed and disgraced. Her only connection to the outside world was the internet, a conduit for her own escalating paranoia. She ignored the vitriol on the neighborhood Facebook page, which had become a public forum for celebrating her downfall. Instead, she obsessively scoured the websites of local news outlets. For days, there was nothing. Then, a short, vague article appeared on the Gila County Sentinel's site. Investigation continues on rural property. The headline read, it spoke of county and sheriff's officials recovering items of historical significance following recent storm damage. It mentioned no names and offered no details. The lack of information was more terrifying than any accusation. It meant they were controlling the narrative. A few days later, a temporary chain-link fence, shrouded in green tarp, was erected around the washout on Yet's property. It was a visual confirmation. They were hiding something important. The official summons arrived via a stony-faced courier who insisted on a signature. It wasn't an arrest warrant, but a formal request for an interview with Detective Harding at the Gila County Sheriff's Station. A cold dread washed over her as she read the date. It was for the following Tuesday. Panic forced her into action. She spent a humiliating afternoon calling law firms. The first 3 criminal defense attorneys she spoke to, once she haltingly explained the situation, politely declined, citing conflicts of interest or a full caseload. They could smell the toxic high-profile mess she was in. Finally, she found a man named Arthur Finch, a weary, cynical lawyer whose office was in a rundown building by the courthouse. He listened to her story without judgment, his only reaction a deep sigh. He agreed to represent her, his fee astronomical. Caroline wrote the check without flinching. Her carefully managed retirement fund was already bleeding. The waiting area, of the sheriff's station was a circle of hell designed with beige plastic chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. Caroline and Mr. Finch sat on one side, a portrait of middle-class dread. Across from them sat Jedediah Stone and Maria Morales. Jed looked as if he hadn't slept in a week, his face pale and drawn. Maria Morales, however, was a rock of composure, her expression calm and unreadable. She spoke to Jed in low, reassuring tones, a shield of professionalism against the oppressive atmosphere. The four of them sat in absolute silence, a quartet of adversaries bound together by a shared catastrophe. Detective Harding, a man who seemed to run on stale coffee and disappointment, called Jed and Morales in first. Caroline was left to wait, the minutes stretching into an eternity. Finch tapped a pen against his legal pad, the rhythmic clicking grating on her already frayed nerves. She tried to project an aura of innocent indignation, but she knew she just looked like what she was, a terrified woman on the verge of losing everything. Finally, the door opened. Jed and Morales emerged, their faces giving nothing away. Harding stood in the doorway. "Mrs. Parker, your turn." The interview room was small and windowless. Detective Harding sat across a metal table from them, a thick file in front of him. Deputy Miller stood by the door, his arms crossed. Finch set up his notepad, advising her in a whisper to say nothing unless he approved it. Harding began by methodically laying out the case against her for the culvert sabotage. He spoke of Brenda's testimony, the wrench marks on the bolts, the landscaper bags, the clear motive established by the prior legal dispute. The evidence was a mountain, and she was buried beneath it. "The district attorney is prepared to charge you with multiple felonies," Harding said, his tone flat. "Criminal damage to property, causing damage to a vital public utility, reckless endangerment. With the amount of damage you caused, you'd be facing significant jail time." Finch cleared his throat. "My client has not been formally charged with anything." Detective Harding ignored him, his eyes locked on Caroline. "However," he said, leaning forward slightly, "circumstances have become complicated. Your little plumbing project, Mrs. Parker, unearthed something else entirely." He slid a photograph across the table. It was a close-up of several dark green, military-style footlockers, rusted and mud-caked, sitting in the bottom of the trench. "We found these buried about 8 feet down," Harding said. "Sealed since the early 1970s. We figure they belong to Mr. Stone's grandfather, a Vietnam veteran named Earl Stone." He slid another photo across. This one showed the contents of one of the lockers, rifles, wrapped in oilcloth. Earl Stone, it seems, had some issues when he came back from the war, deep-seated paranoia. He didn't trust banks. He didn't trust the government. He buried his life savings, his journals, his private papers, and his entire, unregistered, and highly illegal collection of automatic weapons from his time in the service. We're talking M16s, a grease gun, things that will get a federal agent's attention faster than anything I know. Caroline stared at the photo, her mind struggling to connect the dots. "What does that have to do with me?" she whispered. "It has everything to do with you," Harding said. "Right now Jedediah Stone is the unwitting owner of a property containing a buried federal arms cache. He had no knowledge of the journals we recovered, make that perfectly clear, but it's a legal nightmare. It's a mess that could take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to untangle him from, even if he's ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "So now the DA has a choice. He can prosecute 2 separate, complicated cases. Or, we can find a more efficient solution." Finch sat up straighter. "What are you proposing, Detective?" "I'm proposing a deal," Harding said, his gaze returning to Caroline. "Ms. Morales, on behalf of our client, has been very cooperative. She has provided us with everything, including the grandfather's extensive personal records. They want this to go away. We want this to go away. You, Mrs. Parker, are the key." He laid it out. If she were to give a full signed confession to her crimes, if she were to plead guilty, 2 reduced, non-violent felony charges, and if she agreed to pay full and complete restitution for every cent of damage to Gila County for the emergency response and repairs, to the Whispering Aspens HOA for the landscape restoration, and to Jedediah Stone for the catastrophic damage to his road and property, then the DA would be inclined to recommend a sentence of long-term probation, community service, and no jail time. Her confession would officially memorialize her as the sole perpetrator of the event that uncovered the weapons, cementing Yet's status as an innocent victim and allowing the federal issue to be quietly resolved. "You do that," Harding finished, "and you might stay out of prison. You refuse, and I will throw the book at you, and you can watch Mr. Stone's life get ruined by federal agents, right alongside your own." It was a devil's bargain. Her freedom in exchange for her financial ruin and total public humiliation. There was no choice. Finch looked at her, his expression weary. "It's a good deal, Caroline. It's the only deal you're going to get." Swallowing the bile that rose in her throat, she gave a single, jerky nod. The confession took an hour to write and sign. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her old life. She admitted to everything, the planning, the sabotage, the malice. Signing her name at the bottom was the single most difficult act she had ever performed. It was the formal surrender of her entire world. When it was over, Finch walked her out into the hallway. She felt hollowed out, a ghost in sensible shoes. At the far end of the hall, Jedediah and Maria Morales were speaking with the detective. The meeting was over. The deal was done. As Caroline and her lawyer moved toward the exit, Maria Morales turned. She walked toward them, stopping a few feet away. Jed remained behind, watching, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Mrs. Parker," Morales said. Her voice was not triumphant, simply factual. Caroline flinched, expecting one final cutting remark. "As part of our full cooperation, Mr. Stone gave me access to all of his family's records, including the journals and papers recovered from the Foot Lockers," Morales said calmly. "His grandfather Earl was a surveyor for Gila County before he went to war. He was meticulous. He kept copies of everything." Morales paused, her dark eyes holding Caroline's gaze. "He kept his private survey maps of this entire area, drawn in 1957, the same year as the water accord." A strange, cold feeling prickled Caroline's skin. According to Earl Stone's original hand-drawn map of his own property lines and the adjacent county land, Morales continued, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, "that 20 strip of land you set your protest camp on, the one you called a public easement?" She let the silence hang in the air for a heart-stopping second before delivering the final, devastating blow. "It was a public easement. He documented it himself. It seems the county clerk's office lost the official record during a courthouse reorganization in the late